Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Hi. I am Sarah Watson, director at Gagosian, and I need a script for that. And on behalf of my colleagues and the gallery, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this special screening and conversation with Jordan Wolfson and Johanna Burton. This talk has been organized on the occasion of body sculpture, an animatronic work of art that was recently acquired by the National Gallery of Australia in Canberra and is on view at the museum through April 28th, which I think it'll be extended, so you have even more time to get to Canberra. There's also a fabulous catalog accompanying the exhibition with a wonderful contribution from LA's own Russell Ferguson, who's in the audience. Thank you very much. Sorry, had to do it. We are honored to be joined today by the artist and Johanna to share a bit about our speakers. Jordan Wolfson, needs no introduction, but is known for his provocative work in a range of mediums, including sculpture, installation, video, photography, digital animation, and performance. Filtering the languages of online and broadcast media through digital and mechanical technologies and employing an array of invented characters, he crafts enigmatic narratives that explore uncomfortable social and existential topics. In his most recent works, he contrasts the physical, virtual, and imaginary realms, examining the projection of internal impulses onto constructed cells and scenarios and objects. Johanna Burton is the Maurice Marciano Director of the Museum of Contemporary Art, Los Angeles. Among her most prominent curatorial efforts are Trigger, Gender as a Tool and a Weapon at the New Museum, New York in 2017, Take It or Leave It, Institution Image Ideology at the Hammer Museum, Los Angeles in 2014, and Sherry Levine, Mayhem at the Whitney Museum of Art in 2011. Thank you so much, Jordan and Johanna, for being so generous with your time. We are going to begin the day with a film. Thanks.
You want me to take it away?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a very short period of time for a conversation that I think we all want to last longer. So I'm going to keep it a little snappy and then leave a little time at the end for questions. So I also want to thank Sarah Watson and Sarah Jones and the whole Gagosian team. I visited your studio last July, actually looked back at our text messages to see this work in progress before it was shipped to Australia, where you continued to refine it for, I understand, another several months on site. So this work is now currently on view at the National Gallery of Australia, and what we just watched is a highly choreographed, edited documentation. You're pointing at something. My water. You're taking my water. That's okay. You can see how it's going to go. Anyway, a highly choreographed and edited documentation of the work as it's being performed and observed. So I just want to point out the obvious, which is we're not watching the work, we're watching a documentation of the work. You already kind of teed us off, but artists, yourself included, are often thought about as really solitary. But a project like this couldn't be made without a lot of partners, many of whom are in the room. So can you start out by telling us a little bit about the process, the people you work the most closely with, how long the project took to conceive and execute, and where we are today?
Doing a project like this is sort of like asking the Statue of Liberty to draw a photorealistic face for you. Because when you wrote me yesterday, I want to talk about production and labor, I thought, oh, what is it really like doing this? And it's really like, you're sort of asking like this docile giant to draw a very hyper-realistic drawing for you. And a lot of that happens through collaboration. For example, Mark Satrakian's and I's collaboration, which I always think of similar to, for me, working with Mark Satrakian, in a way he's the cinematographer. He's also, in a way, a masterful performer, an actor, who I'm attempting to sort of engage with and direct. And then there'll be a number of people, for example, Brennan Lowe or Ted Marchant, who I worked with more on a kind of technical side to reach sort of technical achievements. I think there's a popular myth that someone that someone would like to extract an artist like myself or someone else from this process, assuming that we aren't engaged in a complete way. but that's absolutely not true. I'm just engaged with the project through an infrastructure of a number of other people who inevitably have an additive factor on the artwork, a positive change on the artwork, the same way a director is working with a cinematographer or an actor or a special technician, that there's always incredible additive, crucial, and things that I wouldn't have come up with myself that are in the artwork because those people are working alongside me. And in a way, like, this piece can't exist without me, but certainly cannot exist without them.
So this is the third in a sequence of epic animatronic sculptures that you've made. I saw all of them, starting with Female Figure in 2014, Colored Sculpture in 2016. Can you say a bit about the trajectory across these works over a decade?
Each one of these artworks, the genesis is about having a kind of me sort of stalking myself and my primitive reactions to things. For example, primitive reactions to representation or primitive reactions to violence, and to kind of observe this sort of human condition and then try and distill that feeling through through these different, like, basically trying to distill or translate, or basically distill and translate these feelings through technology.
When we talked about the sculpture, you talk about the body sculpture essentially being a reflection of the audience member that's watching it. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that and what it means.
It's not exactly that it's the audience member, but it's, so in body sculpture, like I mentioned before, that there's a kind of stalking or witnessing I try to do of myself. I noticed that when I was looking at sculpture, that my physicality was specifically engaged in a relatively subjective way. And then I kept on having this experience, and then I realized that the experience of art was actually a completely physical one. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to distill that into an artwork. Mm-hmm. And that's primarily the genesis of body sculpture. And in terms of it relating to audience members, it's not really like it relates to anyone specifically or to an audience specifically, but it relates to a kind of physical dynamic with someone's, or with one's physical, with one's embodiment physical self.
Thanks. I was struck a lot this time watching the film with, when we did see viewers, how sort of blank, there was a mirroring back of a kind of blankness, even though ostensibly there were a lot of affective registers being played on. So it was interesting to me. Body sculpture is arguably the most abstract of the three sculptures that you've made. It doesn't have a face or eyes, and it doesn't speak. Yet its gestures are, I think, in part due to the evolutions in technology, the most human of all. Mark, you've talked a lot about the fingers, and they're so incredible and so full of affect, but also not human in what they can do. So can you tell us, Jordan, why you moved away from a recognizable human form and what you mean by the words body and sculpture here?
Okay, those are two questions. So first I'm going to do the last one. Okay, so going back to my answer to your last question, body sculpture. It's a sculpture for your body, yep. But it's also a sculpture of a body sculpture. Mm-hmm. And I also thought it kind of sounded seductive as well. That there was a kind of feeling to it, a texture to body sculpture. When I create titles, I like to write them down because some titles look different spoken than they do written. And body, it was like body sculpture. 2023, and it looked really good. It was a feeling. I want to be really straight. Everything I do, it's based on a feeling. I might be a person, I'm smart enough to drive a car and be on stage and do all this stuff, but everything I'm doing, it's really just a reaction, and I'm really just having a feeling. Everything I'm putting into the work, it's not based on an intellectual or moral reasoning. There's no shoulds or shouldn'ts. It's either do I feel more or feel less, and I choose the quality of feeling more. And I try and choose the appropriate thing. The reason body sculpture doesn't have a face was ultimately, I had made all of these artworks. It actually all started with a performance I did for the Frieze Art Fair, and it was called You're Napoleon, and this is back in 2008. And I had these two young actors in their 20s, and they would stare into the eyes of a single audience member. It would be performed for individuals. And I noticed that when they were staring into the eyes of the audience member, that it created a kind of formal bridge. And it was like this bridge where any content could pass over this bridge. And there was somehow everything became equalized. And the greater differences in texture, the more equalizing it was. And it was a very interesting effect. And so then I followed this up with an artwork called Animation Masks, where a Shylock character is looking directly into the camera and never breaks his stare. And then it occurs again in Raspberry Composer. It occurs in Female Figure. It occurs in Colored Sculpture. And the reality is just you can't do the same thing over and over and over again once you got good at it. Yeah. And I had to stop, because if I didn't stop, I would be I'd be doing it to please you guys, not to be in a kind of exploration of my own work. Mm-hmm. And I kind of just felt like I had to let go of it. And one of the things, life is about change, and change is inevitable. And once you master something or become whatever, I didn't say I master putting faces in artworks and eyes in artworks. That's a ridiculous thing to say. But once you've done it enough times, and you don't really have beginner's mind anymore. You don't feel like a beginner. And one of the great qualities of making art is having a kind of quality of a nascent sense, like a beginner sense in making it. And that allows, one to stay fresh, stay on their toes. And so I had to make, I made an active decision that body sculpture wouldn't have eyes. And then I remember when the acquisition occurred at the National Gallery, I got an email, and it was like, Jordan, we have an email from this curator who just would like to remind you that body sculpture has no eyes. As if I had left it out or something. And I'm a relatively self-insecure person, so of course I got a little paranoid about it. And there were times where I'd be like, Mark, we got to do something. And Mark would be like, Jordan, we're not doing anything. And I wanted to put video screens on it and this and that, because I was so desperate to see it and desperate for it to work. And when you see something over and over again, you become numb to it. So
I just want to be clear. I didn't say the eyes were missing. I just wanted to make sure I plumbed that question. Just to follow on that, body sculpture doesn't exist to showcase technological advances, though it does rely on them. Things have changed in the 10 years you've been working this way. So it's not a performance of virtuosity or technological advances, but it does show those too. The fingers couldn't have worked that way. I'm sorry, I keep gesturing to you, Mark, but they couldn't have worked that way 10 years ago. But you do aim to invoke in your viewer raw emotional or physical reactions. So what is the relationship between the kind of technological and the primordial for you? And I do have a second question. How are you thinking about your work differently today, given the current contexts and dialogues around AI?
Okay, I'm going to answer the second question. So I'm going to talk about AI for a second. there's two parts of AI. There's the part that that you guys might be aware of, and I'm sure you're aware of other parts, but there's a part primarily about generating images and then generating like moving images from images. I'm really ultimately not interested in that. That's already antiquated. And they said that AI would create this like AI basically is the singularity that Ray Kurzweil predicted. Like it's pretty obvious that it is that. And this idea of the images and the singularity, and what's amazing about all this DALL-E stuff and what was like Mid-Journey or whatever, is that it's already old. It's like already become antiquated. It became antiquated so quickly, faster than anything I had ever seen become antiquated. And I think that phenomenologically is actually really compelling. What I am interested in terms of AI would be how could I use AI in my art practice? For example, if Mark and I were trying to choreograph a scene and we wanted the robot to put the gun up to its head, I could ask AI, I could submit a bunch of videos that we've already made into the AI, and then I could prompt it to say, create 25 variations on this in the style of. And then we could look at those things and we could say, 3 of those variations is really compelling and something we didn't think of. And then we could integrate those. And then if we were having a software issue, like in terms of integrating those movements, for example, if we could say, come up with like 10 solutions to solve this software issue, or solve the software issue for us. And then it would do that. And that's AI. That's what's going to change in terms of AI. The other stuff is primarily AI is going to just create a lot of havoc in our lives because of security risks, because you're not going to be able to necessarily have the same relationship to your password and like two-step authentication anymore. That's also just going to be an issue. So that's all I'll say about AI. And the other thing is, what was your?
It was technology and primordial affect. What is the relationship?
Actually, my girlfriend and I were talking about this over breakfast. Is that the issues that were happening when Caravaggio were alive? You could say topically were different, but they was having the same experience, right? The experience of fear of death, anxiety, suffering. I mean, what's our lives is kind of our lives sort of fluctuate between suffering and non-suffering, or fear and non-fear. Yeah. And so technology is something you can wear and it can change, but the human condition is essentially the same. And so it doesn't really matter. And I was thinking a lot also about being an artist, is that if you look at like an artist's career, it's like someone, someone says, it's like, so there's like say there's a certain technology, and you could say it could be 3D printing, right? So 3D printing comes out. So the advent of 3D printing, and then they combine it with some type of like contemporary moral dialectic thing. So it could be about social justice, or it could be about climate change, or whatever. And so they have like a contemporary moral and a contemporary medium, and then they blend the two, and then they do it in an excellent way, and they become a famous artist from that, and they make lots of money. And the problem is the times are going to change, and so that moral dialectic is going to change, and then the technology becomes antiquated and changes. But a lot of times artists will say, "Oh, that's my style, and I'm going to make this until I'm 90 years old," and that's how artists get lost, like a dinghy, getting cut off from a boat traveling through the ocean. They just get lost in that. And so if you think about it, it's like being an artist, it's And for me, my primary thing is that like I'm interested in engaging in technology and it to be a snapshot, and that technology is a snapshot of the times we're living in. So my hope is that, you know, body sculpture is a snapshot of the times that we're living in, and it deals with just fundamental issues of suffering and non-suffering. The same thing specifically with the VR piece, Real Violence. It's exactly made for the times, but I'm not going back and I'm not trying to make another VR piece like that. And so if you're constantly moving and engaging with, you know, contemporary morals and contemporary technology, and you don't, and you kind of like don't, you know, give in to like the money art system thing. This is just like what I was thinking about self-consciously for myself. I probably like shouldn't really regurgitate it to you guys, but it's that basically that's a path for living a creative life that's constantly new and constantly refreshed, rather than it being based on like, you know, collecting things that keep you secure.
So I'll follow up with that with something we started to talk about, which is we've both in our work addressed the desire for empathy culturally. It's a word that gets used a lot. An artist like you gets critiqued for putting content forward that's seen as inflammatory or violent without taking a position on it. And I'm curious if you can talk a little bit about that.
I don't think that like me having a position is useful. You should treat me like a camera with a cracked lens, and the images that come through get distorted and get repeated, and you say, oh, that's how the world looks through that camera, or that's how the world looks, and this is how this one camera says the world looks. And it's just about that. I'm just like pointing at something and seeing something, and that whatever associations I have with that, I parse and then I make an artwork. But it has, I don't feel that my role is to make the world a better place. My role isn't to teach anyone a lesson. My role isn't to tell you you should feel shame or you should feel pride. But my role is a witness. I'm just like a witness. And if you had a witness in court, you would want an unbiased witness. And to say, what did you see? It's like, I saw that guy light that car on fire. But that's just about it. That's as direct as it goes. Rather than, I saw that guy light that car on fire, and you know what? I don't like that guy. And so that's the difference. So I'm just a camera.
What's the crack? You said there's a crack.
The crack is, you know, my subjective experiences, which will inevitably pollute the viewing. But that's what makes it interesting, and that's what makes it mine. When an artist is successful, this pollution of the viewing, the information cycles through that pollution of viewing, and then it comes out, and then it becomes, you know, potentially universal again. It's like what they say is that the personal is political.
Two quick last questions, and then we'll open up. I was really interested in watching, you use language around this work being arranged in chapters or scenes, and you've also called them climaxes, which is something we could plumb, but maybe we won't. But I was really excited about the way the piece is about sound and touch as much as vision. So I wondered if you could talk a bit about the musicality. The sound panel on the front is actually a drum panel. It was produced explicitly to have a wide range of tonalities and to be played like an instrument. And obviously the kind of gestures of touch are some of the most uncanny parts of the piece. Will you just talk a little bit about sound and touch?
Sure. One of the things was I wanted the artwork to sort of perform like a number of like fundamental sort of things humans do, and you know, sex, violence, shame, and also it's fundamental for us to perform, to be the performer or to be the witness of performer. It's fundamental for us to have this performer-audience relationship. And so when we created the sculpture, Mark designed it to be a drum. The front is a drum. And then Mark designed software that was essentially a drum machine. He turned the robot itself into a drum machine. And then Mark and I collaborated with Eli Kessler, and we created the music for it. Yeah.
All right, final question. This book, which I just got a couple of days ago, documents really closely the sort of apparatus, I guess is what I'll say, of the machine. But in the very middle is, I think it's two pictures, but it's really one picture of you as a little kid, right in the heart of the book. Why is it there?
I don't know. It goes back to that question about like all these ideas about, so you have that subjective pathway that the information has to pass through, because all of us have these experiences, and a lot of us had a lot of we all had our primary experiences, I think, in that age probably.
Yeah.
And so I guess probably a lot of my work comes from that. Maybe that's the point of my subjectivity, comes from that. But it's a picture of me also in a library. Mm-hmm. And for me, it's also about learning, and it's about enthusiasm, and it's also somehow it's also about excellence.
Yeah.
And there's the whole side that, you can have a relationship to an artist about. And they make this art, and it's mean, and it's that, and they must be like this, and they must be like that. But if you got to know me, I'm obsessed with doing good work. I'm obsessed with excellence. I consider myself, in a kind of way, an athlete. And so that image represents excellence, and it represents subjectivity.
Why is it there twice?
Because it looked good.
All right, I think good place to end.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.